Before I lost him, before I lost myself, there was a dinner party. It was the last night our life looked perfect from the 30th floor. It was also the night my husband of 20 years, Mark, suggested we evolve. That's the word he used, all charm and progressive ideals, as he held a glass of expensive Cabernet. It was a much kinder word than destroy, but in the end, they meant exactly the same thing. The sound of our parties was what I always noticed first. It was a specific chord, a blend of low-thrumming jazz, the sharp clink of ice in heavy glasses, and Mark's laugh, always a full-throated baritone, cresting above the conversational murmur. That night, the chord was perfect. From my post by the kitchen island, I watched my husband hold court. He was telling the story about his keynote in Berlin, and he had the entire group, our friends, his colleagues, a city councilman, in his hand. His silver gray hair caught the light from the track lighting I'd spent a month agonizing over. He was 50, but he had the restless energy of a man half his age. He gestured, a glass of dark Cabernet swirling in his hand, and the light caught his signet ring. And the translator, he boomed, he just stops, looks at me, looks at the audience and says, "I am sorry, but what he has just said. It is too American to translate." The group erupted. I smiled. It was the smile I'd perfected over 2 decades. Warm, supportive, and just a little tired at the edges. The Sarah smile, Mark called it. Our apartment was on the 30th floor, a glass box overlooking the river and the ever-expanding skyline of Austin. We were the it couple, the ones who had made it. The architect and her brilliant, charismatic husband, the urban developer. We'd built this life, this space, from nothing. The cool quartz under my palms was real. The view that fell away into a carpet of lights was real. I picked up an empty flute from the counter. The rim sticky with Prosecco. "Sarah, you've done it again." It was Cynthia, draped in something beige and expensive. "This place, it's just..." She waved a hand, rings glittering. "Goals. Thanks, Cynthia. Can I get you another?" "Oh no. But you and Mark." She leaned in, her perfume a cloud of sandalwood and vanilla. 20 years, right? How do you keep it all so, well, fresh?" Her question hung in the air, smelling like stale perfume. I felt the smile tighten on my face. "We're lucky," I said. The practiced answer. I moved through the room, collecting empty glasses, my silk dress whispering against my legs. It felt a little too tight, or maybe I'd just been standing for too long. I rescued a damp napkin from the leather Eames chair I'd saved for 6 months to buy. Mark caught my eye from across the room. He was listening to the councilman now, nodding seriously, his brow furrowed. He winked at me. A quick conspiratorial flash. "We're a team. We're nailing this." I winked back, then turned toward the hall, needing a moment's silence. The hallway was dim, a gallery of black and white photos I'd taken. Our trips, our life, our first tiny apartment, Mark painting the walls, splattered in white. Us on the day we'd signed the papers for our firm, and then I saw it. On the console table, a simple black metal frame. Inside, a photo of the two of us, younger, laughing on a beach, the wind whipping my hair across my face. It was my favorite. I had hung it myself, centered perfectly over the table, measured with a laser level. It was crooked, tilted a good 10 degrees to the right. Mark had been standing here earlier, telling another story. He must have leaned against the wall or grabbed the frame to make a point and just left it. My breath hitched. It was a small thing, a stupid thing, but it was mine. I'd placed it. He'd moved it without even noticing. It was the 3rd time this month my fingers twitched. I glanced back at the living room. The party's hum was a wall of sound. No one was looking. I reached out, my thumb and forefinger finding the cool metal. I nudged it. Back. Straight. My eyes aligned the top edge with the line of the ceiling. There. I took a deep breath, the air sterile and climate-controlled. I could feel a headache starting, a dull press behind my eyes. I smoothed the front of my dress and walked back into the noise. By midnight, they were gone. The last guest, the councilman, had clapped Mark on the shoulder. Incredible, Mark, just incredible. We'll be in touch. The door snicked shut, the deadbolt thunked, and the silence was deafening. It was louder than the party had ever been. Just the hum of the city, the whisper of the air conditioning, the distant wail of a siren. The living room was a wreck. A beautiful, expensive wreck, glasses filled with dregs of red wine, plates smeared with the remnants of rosemary-crusted lamb, cushions dented on the sofa. I sighed and picked up a stray cocktail napkin. Time to clean. It was my ritual. I put the house to bed, and in doing so, I put my own anxieties to bed. I started stacking glasses, the clink, 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 a small, sharp sound in the quiet. Sarah. I jumped. Mark was standing by the window, his back to me, looking out at the lights. His suit jacket was off, his white shirt brilliant in the gloom. "Leave it," he said. His voice was different. The performance was over. This was a new tone, one I couldn't place. It was quiet, serious. "It'll just take a minute," I said, my hands still full of glasses. "It's better to do it now." "No." He turned and his face was unreadable. The charming host was gone. This was someone else. "Leave it. Come and sit down." He didn't move toward the sofa. He just stood there, waiting for me. "Mark?" My heart gave a strange, hard kick. "What is it? Did something happen with the councilman?" No, nothing like that." He ran a hand through his hair, and for the first time that night, he looked his age. He looked tired, but his eyes, they were sharp, focused. "We need to talk," he said. "About us. About the next stage." The glasses in my hand suddenly felt impossible, and I walked slowly, carefully to the island. I set them down, but the clink sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The headache behind my eyes flared, sharp and bright. "The next stage," I repeated. My voice was flat. I pressed my palms flat on the quartz. It was cold, and the cold was grounding. "What next stage?" We're talking about the new waterfront proposal, right? The joint venture?" Mark shook his head. He finally moved, walking not to me but to the bar cart. He picked up his glass of Cabernet from the party, looked at it, then set it down. He picked up the crystal decanter of whiskey instead. "No," he said, his back to me. The glug of the liquid hitting the glass was painfully loud. "Not the firm. Us, you and me, Sarah." I waited. The hum from the wine fridge kicked in, a low vibration that I could feel through my feet. He turned, a heavy tumbler in his hand. His face was set in that rational look he used for difficult clients. The one that said, "I am the adult in the room, and I have a solution you just haven't thought of yet." "I love you," he said. "You know that, right? You're my life. You're my rock," I nodded, my throat tight. He was using the words I loved, but the tone was all wrong. It was a preamble, a disclaimer before the crash. "I love you, but..." "Sarah, I look at us. I look at Cynthia tonight, asking how we keep it fresh. And the truth is..." He took a sip. "Are we? Fresh? We're comfortable," I managed. "We're happy." "We're in a routine," he countered, not unkindly. "A very beautiful, very expensive routine. But it's a routine. We're 48. We're 50. This can't be it, can it? The next 30 years of dinner parties and being comfortable?" He started to pace, the whiskey swirling. "I was reading this article about evolution. How couples who last, they don't just stay the same. They evolve. They trust each other on a level that other people, well, frankly, they're too scared to." I knew suddenly. I knew what was coming. The knowledge was cold and sharp, a piece of glass in my gut. I felt the blood drain from my face. The room seemed to tilt, the city lights outside the window blurring into long, wet streaks. "Mark," I whispered. "Don't. Just hear me out," he said, holding up a hand. He was in full pitch mode now. "We are stronger than other couples. We are smarter. We built a life, a business, on trust." He stopped, standing right in front of me. His eyes were bright, energized. "I think we should open our marriage." The words just hung there, suspended in the air between us, over the wreckage of the party. The smell of stale wine and wilted herbs rose from the island. Open. Our marriage. I couldn't breathe. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the 30th floor. I gripped the counter. What? What are you talking about? It's an evolution of trust, Sarah, that's all. It's not about replacing you. God, no, he laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor. You can't be replaced. This is about re-energizing us, about bringing new energy back into this relationship. It's progressive. That was the word that made my stomach churn. He was framing this as a strength, which meant any hesitation on my part was, what? A weakness. I felt the labels forming in my head. The ones I'd spent my whole life fighting. Insecure, possessive, jealous, old-fashioned. It's just sex. Sarah, he said, his voice dropping, becoming intimate, persuasive. It doesn't mean anything. What we have, this, he gestured around the apartment. This is our life. You are my life. This is just an experience, something to share. We'd have complete honesty. We'd set rules. It would be safe. I can't, I stammered. The room was too hot. The silk of my dress was sticking to my back. Mark, no. I don't want that. His face changed. The persuasive charm hardened, just a fraction. Disappointment. You don't want it or you're afraid of it? He asked. Because they're different things. I thought you trusted me. After 20 years, I thought we trusted each other. There it was. The gaslight. The gentle, reasonable twist that made my panic feel like a personal failing. My no wasn't a boundary. It was a lack of trust. Of course I trust you, I said, but my voice was thin. It sounded like a lie, even to me. Then what's the problem? He set his glass down on the quartz with a sharp clack. Is it that you're worried I'll find someone else? Or is it that you're worried you won't? It was a cruel, brilliant question. It pinned me. Either I was insecure about his love, or I was insecure about my own desirability. That's not... I couldn't finish. I couldn't find the words. I am a monogamist, I wanted to scream. I don't want to sleep with anyone else. I don't want you to sleep with anyone else. I want the life we had. But I said nothing. I just stood there, shaking my head, my hair falling into my face. He saw his opening. He stepped closer, his voice softening again. He touched my arm. His hand was warm. Hey. He tilted his head. I'm not saying yes or no tonight. I'm just saying, think about it. Don't react like everyone else. You're not everyone else. You're Sarah. He made my name sound like a shield, like a challenge. Just think about it, he repeated, as an experiment. A way to prove to ourselves and to everyone that we're not like those other couples. The ones who just fade away. He kissed my forehead. It was a chaste, dismissive kiss. The kiss of a man who has just concluded a business meeting. I'm going to bed, he said. Don't stay up all night with this. I watched him walk down the hall. I heard the click of our bedroom door. I was alone in the beautiful, wrecked living room with the city lights winking at me like 1,000 mocking eyes. He had said, think about it, but it didn't feel like a question. It felt like a test. My eyes landed on the crooked picture frame I had straightened hours ago. It was still perfectly aligned. A cold dread washed over me. The fear of saying yes was suffocating, but beneath it was a new, sharper terror, the absolute, bone-deep certainty that if I said no, I would lose him anyway. The proposal wasn't the start of a negotiation. It was the announcement that he was already gone. I cleaned the apartment that night. I did it on autopilot, my hands moving with a precision that my mind couldn't access. I scrubbed, rinsed, and polished until 3 in the morning, until the last smears of wine were gone and every cushion was plumped. I was restoring order to the space because my entire life had just been declared a disorder. The next morning, the apartment was pristine, sterile, and smelled faintly of lemon and bleach. Mark walked into the kitchen, dressed for his morning run, all bright white fabrics and manic energy. He kissed the top of my head as I stared into a black coffee. Morning, did you sleep? I said nothing. My throat felt like it was full of sand. Look, he sighed. That familiar sound of manufactured patience. Don't sulk, Sarah. This isn't an attack. It's a conversation. We're just talking. But it wasn't a conversation. It was a siege. And it lasted exactly 1 week. It wasn't one big dramatic fight. It was a war of attrition, 1,000 small cuts. It was Mark, over dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant, the scent of garlic and oregano thick in the air, leaning forward and putting his hand on mine. "I'm trying to save us, Sarah," he'd said, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "Don't you see? I don't want to be one of those men who has a sordid, secret affair. I'm trying to do this the right way, an honest way. I'm trying to include you." He made his preemptive betrayal sound like a virtue. It was me, later that night, trying to articulate my fear. "But it will change us, Mark. It will break something." He'd looked at me, his eyes full of a pity that made my skin crawl. "It's already broken, Sarah. That's what I'm trying to tell you. This is how we fix it. By proving that our bond is stronger than just possession." It was the nights. The long, silent hours in our king-sized bed, the expensive Egyptian cotton sheets feeling cold and vast. We'd lie on our respective sides, a canyon of silence between us. I'd feel him shift, hear him sigh into the darkness. "I'm disappointed," he whispered one night, his voice thick with, not sadness, but frustration. "I really thought you trusted me. After everything, I thought you were more than this, more than this, more than a woman who wanted her husband to herself." He made my loyalty sound like a character flaw. By Thursday, I was barely eating. I'd sit at my desk in our shared home office, trying to focus on the blueprints for a new library, but the lines would swim. The crisp, clean angles of my work blurred into chaos. I'd listen to the click-clack of his keyboard in the next room, a rapid, confident tempo. He was fine. He was energized. I was disintegrating. On Friday night, I found him on the balcony, looking out at the river. The air was cool, smelling of rain and city exhaust. I hadn't slept in 2 days. I felt brittle, like a dead leaf. I was the one who broke. "If," I said, my voice a dry croak, "if we did this experiment," he turned. His face was unreadable in the twilight, but I could feel the stillness in him, the sudden absolute focus. He didn't rush in. He waited. "What would the rules be?" A slow smile spread across his face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a smile of validation. He'd won. He walked over to me, took my cold hands in his. "This," he said, "is why I love you. This is you, Sarah. Brave, smart, always willing to see the bigger picture." He led me inside to the dining room table. He poured 2 glasses of wine. I didn't touch mine. He sat suddenly all business. He was prepared. He'd been thinking about this all week while I'd been panicking. "Okay," he said, leaning forward, all we're a team energy. Rules are good. They make it safe. Rule number 1, and this is the most important. No one from our professional or social circles, ever. No one we know," I whispered. "Exactly," he said, nodding. "It has to be clean, detached, strangers, people who don't matter. It protects us. It protects this." He tapped the solid wood of the table. No emotional entanglements, no complications. It sounded so logical, so considerate. It felt like a concession to my fears. My turn. My mind was scrambling, trying to build a fence, any fence. "Rule number 2, I said, my voice gaining a fraction of strength. "Complete honesty. If you're with someone, I have to know, before and after. No secrets, Mark, not one." He agreed almost too quickly. "Absolutely. 100%. Total transparency. You'll know everything, and me. I'll know everything about you, too." The thought of it, of me with another man, was so repulsive, so alien. I just felt a wave of nausea. I gripped the edge of the table. The wood felt solid, real. Rule number 3. This was the one that mattered. This was the one I'd been repeating in my head like a prayer. Not here. Not in our home. Not in my space, and never in our bed. That's sacred. It stays ours. "Of course," he said, reaching across and squeezing my hand. "Of course. This apartment, our bed, this is the center. This is home. I would never violate that, Sarah. You have my word." He let go and sat back, swirling his wine. The ruby liquid caught the light. "One last one then," he said, his voice casual. "Rule number 4, it's temporary. It's an experiment. Let's give it 6 months. Just 6 months to see. We can check in, see how we feel. If at any point if you hate it, if it's not working, we stop. We just stop. No harm, no foul. Back to us. 6 months." It sounded like an eternity. It also sounded like a lifeline, an escape clause. I looked at him, my husband of 20 years, the man I had built my entire adult life with. He was smiling at me, that warm, persuasive smile that had charmed clients and city councils for 2 decades. He was offering me a compromise that felt like a command. He was offering me a safe way to do the one thing that felt utterly, terrifyingly unsafe. I looked down at my own hands, pale against the dark wood. I had negotiated the terms of my own surrender. I had drawn the boundaries on the map of my own betrayal. "So," he said, his voice soft, coaxing, "we're doing this? We agree?" He was waiting for the final word, the yes that would unlock the door. I stared at the full glass of wine he'd poured for me, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the cold modern lights of our dining room. I looked at the wine. I looked at the man who was my husband. His face was open, expectant, waiting for the password that would let him into his new, exciting world. And I saw it. I saw the life we had, the 30th floor view, the Eames chair I had saved for, the 20 years of shared jokes and silent dinners. I saw the terrifying empty space that would be left if he walked out. And he was going to walk out. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a hostage situation. And I was the only one in chains. The fear of the apartment's silence was suddenly, horrifyingly, greater than the fear of the arrangement. I lifted my chin. I looked him in the eye. "Yes," I said, my voice didn't even tremble. It was a cold, hard little word. A slow breath escaped him. The tension left his shoulders. But the expression that crossed his face wasn't relief. It wasn't the look of a man who had just saved his marriage. It was triumph. He smiled, a wide, genuine smile, and in that instant, I wasn't his partner. I was an obstacle he had just overcome. "Good," he said. He finally picked up his own wine, the one he'd been nursing. "Good. To us, Sarah. To evolution." He held his glass out. I didn't move. My hands were still on the table. After a beat, he brought the glass back and took a long, satisfied drink. I had just betrayed my own heart to keep a man who was already celebrating his freedom from it. That was the first piece of myself I lost. It just evaporated. Mark was considerate. That was the most brutal part. He was meticulously considerate. He followed the rules. 2 weeks later, a Tuesday, he was knotting his tie. A different tie. A silk, dark blue one I hadn't seen before. "I won't be home for dinner," he said, adjusting the knot in the mirror. He met my eyes in the reflection. "I have a date." He said it as casually as if he were going to the gym. "Rule number 2, he added, a little brighter. "Honesty." "Oh," I said. I was sitting on the edge of our bed, our sacred bed, a cup of coffee cooling in my hands. The ceramic was warm, but my fingers were ice cold. "Okay, it's just a drink. A woman from, well, you don't need the details, right? It's no complications." He turned, looking handsome, looking vital. "Her name is Alice. I should be back around 11. He kissed me. A dry peck on the cheek. He smelled like expensive soap and something else. A new cologne, something sharp and citrusy. "Don't wait up," he said. The snick of the deadbolt locking was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. I sat there. I didn't move. The coffee went from warm to cold. The sun set, and the city lights began to prick the dark. But I didn't turn on a lamp. I just sat in the growing shadows in our sacred space and pictured him. Him smiling that charming smile. Him leaning in, his voice a low murmur. Him touching a stranger's hand. He came home at 11:15. I was in the living room, pretending to read a book on architectural theory. The pages felt like sandpaper. He came in, loosening the new tie. He looked energized. "So?" I asked, and I hated the way my voice sounded. Tight. needy. So, he said, shrugging off his jacket. It was fine, nice woman. We had a couple of drinks at that new place on the east side. He paused, looking at me. And yes, we went back to her apartment. A yes to the unasked question. Honesty. I felt the floor drop out from under me. It was a physical sensation, a lurch in my gut. He'd done it. The abstract horror was now a concrete fact. Oh, I said again. It was fine, Sarah, that's it. Just fine. He came over, kissed the top of my head. See, the world didn't end. We're okay. I'm home. I'm with you. He went into the bedroom. I heard the shower turn on, the hiss of hot water washing her off him before he got into our bed. He thrived. He had 2 dates the next week. 1 date the week after. He was lighter. He laughed more. He'd come home and, per rule number 2, give me the clinical passionless report. It was a new form of torture. He was sharing his infidelity with me, and I had agreed to listen. You should try it, you know, he said one morning, over the whir of the espresso machine. It's interesting. You might even like it. I don't know, I said. Just try, he pressed. It's not fair for this to be one-sided. It's an experiment, remember? We both have to participate. He was right. My non-participation was, again, a failure. A lack of commitment to our evolution, so I did it. I downloaded an app. I, Sarah Knowles, 48 years old, an accomplished architect, made a profile. I used a photo from 3 years ago. I felt sick doing it. I matched with a man. He was a software developer. Divorced. His picture was fine. We agreed to meet for a drink. A dark bar downtown, the kind of place with sticky floors and a jukebox. The moment I walked in, I wanted to leave. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, industrial cleaner, and artificial cherry from the cocktails. I found him in a back booth. He was not his picture. He was shorter, his shirt was rumpled, and his laugh was too loud. Sarah! He boomed, standing up. He smelled like cheap aftershave and something vaguely sour. Hi, I said, sliding into the vinyl booth. It was cracked, and a piece of foam poked my leg. So, he said, his eyes roving over me with an undisguised, hungry appraisal. An architect, huh? That's hot. I ordered a vodka soda. It tasted like metal. For an hour, I listened. He talked about his job, his ex-wife, his boat. He kept touching me, a hand on my arm to make a point, a nudge with his knee under the table. Each touch felt like an electric shock, a violation. This wasn't intimacy. This wasn't energy. This was just bleak. You're not much of a talker, are you? He said, his hand now resting on my thigh. It was damp. I looked at his hand. This strange, damp hand on my leg. I thought of Mark. I thought of my apartment. I thought of the cool quartz counters and the clean, sterile air. I didn't want him. I didn't want him. I didn't want anyone. I just wanted my husband. I wanted my life back. I have to go, I said. I stood up so abruptly I almost knocked over my drink. Whoa, hey, what's the rush? I'm sorry. I have to go. I half ran out of the bar, sucking in the cool night air. It was sharp with car exhaust, but it was clean. I felt cheap. I felt guilty. And I had never, in my entire life, felt so utterly, completely alone. I got home. The apartment was quiet. Mark was on the sofa, laptop open, the blue light illuminating his face. He looked up. Hey, you're back. I couldn't speak. I just stood in the entryway, my bag digging into my shoulder. How was it? He asked. That same supportive tone. It was awful, I whispered. My eyes started to burn. It was horrible, Mark. It was. Oh, he said. He closed the laptop. Well, they can't all be winners. He smiled, a gentle, understanding smile. But you did it. See, you tried. That's the important part. It's not so bad, is it? The world didn't end. I looked at him, at this man who was supposed to be my life. He was supporting me. He was proud of me for my hollow, disgusting date, and I realized, with a cold, sickening clarity, that this was what he'd wanted all along. My participation wasn't about me evolving. It was about him being absolved. My date made his dates fair. My one miserable, awkward hour of feeling cheap had just purchased him 6 months of guilt-free freedom. The experiment settled into a new, hideous normal. August bled into a crisp October. The 6-month experiment was more than halfway over, and the clock was ticking. Mark's dates with strangers, the ones announced with that brittle, forced honesty, had all but stopped. I'd allowed myself to feel a small, dangerous flicker of hope. Maybe the experiment had run its course. Maybe he'd gotten it out of his system. Maybe he was tired of it. I was wrong. He wasn't tired. He had just changed tactics. The dates were replaced by work. It started as a trickle. A text at 6 p.m. "Hey, team meeting running way over. Don't wait up." Then it was a call at 7. "We're on a roll, Sarah. Ordering in. This is too important to stop." I was an architect. I knew what a deadline felt like. I understood the manic energy of a late-night session, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and printer toner. I had lived that life with him, but this was different. When he came home now, at 1 or 2 in the morning, he wasn't just tired. He was wired. He was incandescent, thrumming with an energy that had nothing to do with me. "This new protege," he said one night, shrugging off his coat. He'd come in at 1:30 a.m. "Chloe, she's a firecracker." I was in my robe, nursing a cup of chamomile, the bitter floral taste coating my tongue. Chloe Renault, 31. We just poached her from that big firm in Chicago." He unknotted his tie, his movements quick, electric. "Honestly, Sarah, she reminds me of you back when we started. She's just relentless. And her ideas for the waterfront, my God. She's brilliant." He was comparing her to me. He was giving her to me as a compliment. I felt the tea turn sour in my stomach. "That's great," I said. The name, once introduced, was everywhere. It was Chloe's take on the zoning, or Chloe found a new investor, or Chloe and I are just grabbing a bite to prep for the investor meeting. A cold, creeping dread began to build in my chest. This bite to prep was at 8 p.m. This working late was every night. The lines were blurring. The rules we'd made, those flimsy, desperate little fences, were designed for strangers. For Alice, the woman from the bar. For Jen, the one-night drink. Where did Chloe fit? I was in our shared home office trying to finalize the HVAC plans for the library. The silence of the apartment was oppressive. Mark's side of the office, his sleek glass and steel desk, was empty. His chair was pushed in. I stared at his dark monitor. Rule number 1. No one from our professional or social circles. Ever. It protects us. That had been his rule. His most important rule. I felt a flash of self-loathing. Was I really this person? The jealous, suspicious wife? He was working. He was building his legacy, the one I had helped him start. And I was jealous of his new star employee? "Don't be paranoid, Sarah. It's not a good look." I could almost hear him say it. I tried to push it down. I focused on my screen, on the clean, logical lines of the ductwork. At 10:15 p.m., my phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Mark. Crisis. "Chloe found a huge flaw in the environmental report. We're at the office working all night. Have to scrap the presentation. Don't wait up." I stared at the message. The library plans in front of me seemed to fade. All I could see was Chloe. Chloe and I. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly in the quiet. I walked to the kitchen and stood at the window, looking down at the city. The lights were indifferent. The river was a slash of black ink. He was lying. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical certainty. It was in the pit of my stomach, cold and hard as a stone. This crisis, this flaw, it was a story. It was a cover. He came home at 2:30 a.m. I was on the living room sofa, in the dark. I hadn't moved for hours. I heard his key in the lock, the soft snick of the deadbolt. He flipped on the entryway light, and his head jerked back when he saw me. "God, Sarah." He clutched his chest. "You scared me. What are you doing sitting in the dark?" He looked wrecked. His tie was gone, his shirt was untucked, his hair was a mess, but he was still vibrating with that manic energy. And he smelled faintly but unmistakably of wine. Not our earthy, expensive Cabernet. Something light and sweet. A Sauvignon Blanc. "How was the crisis?" I asked. My voice was a dry rasp. Oh, it was... He scrubbed a hand over his face. A nightmare. But we fixed it. Chloe. She's a miracle worker. We just powered through it. Grabbed a bottle of wine from that place by the office and hammered it out. He was unbuttoning his shirt, not looking at me. I'm exhausted. I'm going to shower. Mark, I said. He stopped, his hand on the top button. Yeah? You're spending a lot of time with her. He froze. Then he turned slowly. A look of genuine, almost comical disbelief crossed his face. He laughed. It was a short, sharp puff of air. What? You're with her every night. You're working. You come home smelling like wine. You canceled our dinner for her. He dropped his shirt. He walked over to me, his shadow falling across me on the sofa. His face was no longer amused. It was insulted. Sarah, are you actually jealous? Of Chloe? I'm just observing, I said, my hands clenching into fists on my knees. Observing what? He snapped. That I'm working my ass off? She is a kid, Sarah. She's 31. She's my protege. She is work. He was ticking the points off, his voice rising, jabbing the air with his finger. And, more importantly, she is in our professional circle. That is rule number 1, the most important rule. The rule I made to protect us. He shook his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face. It was the same look he'd given me when I'd first hesitated about the open marriage. I cannot believe you, he whispered, as if I had betrayed him. You know me. I would never break that rule. It's the only thing that makes this whole experiment safe. He was using the rule as his shield. He was claiming his fidelity to our arrangement as proof that he wasn't violating it. You need to stop, he said, and his voice was suddenly iron cold. The charm was gone, replaced by a chilling authority. Don't be paranoid. It's not a good look, Sarah. It's possessive. After everything. After all the trust we've built, he made my suspicion a crime. He made my observation an act of jealousy. He made me the crazy wife. He sighed, rubbing his temples as if I had given him a headache. Look, I'm exhausted. We're on a deadline. That's all. It's just work. He bent down and kissed my forehead. His lips were cool. Good night. I watched him walk away. I listened to the click of the bedroom door, the hiss of the shower. I sat there in the dark, the scent of her wine on his breath hanging in the air like a poison. He had said all the right words. He had reminded me of the rules. He had called me paranoid, and I knew, with a certainty that settled in my bones like a killing frost, that he was lying. It was a Sunday morning in late November, cold and brilliantly clear. The light that streamed through our floor-to-ceiling windows was sharp, unforgiving, and exposed every speck of dust in the air. Mark was in Dallas, a 2-day regional developers conference. He'd left on Friday, rolling his small carry-on bag, kissing me on the cheek. Try to relax, Sarah, he'd said, his voice full of that false paternal concern. You seem so on edge. I'll be back Sunday night. I was on edge. I'd been on edge for a month. I lived in a state of low-grade, sickening dread, a constant vibration under my skin. His gaslighting had been effective. I had no proof, only a gut feeling, and he had made me feel insane for having it. So I did what I always do when the world feels like it's tilting. I imposed order. I sat at my sleek white desk in our home office, my coffee, now lukewarm, tasting of ash, at my elbow. It was the 15th of the month. Time to pay the bills. This was my domain. The finances, the statements, the structural integrity of our shared life. Mark handled the pitches and the schmoozing. I handled the spreadsheets and the accounts. I logged into our joint Amex account, the blue and white interface familiar and soothing. I sipped the cold coffee. My eyes scanned the list of charges. Whole Foods, Exxon, our dry cleaners, Amazon, Amazon, Amazon. It was the boring, domestic litany of our life. And then I saw it. My heart didn't stop. It just gave a hard, painful kick in my ribs like a boot. Charge. The Cypress Tower. 84722. The Cypress Tower. My breath caught. I didn't breathe in. I didn't breathe out. I just froze. It wasn't just a hotel. It was the hotel. The one with the rooftop pool that cantilevered over the city. The one with the bar where the cocktails were rumored to be $30 apiece. The place Mark and I had been saving for our 20th anniversary 2 years ago. But we'd been too busy. We'd gotten takeout and watched a documentary instead. 7022. That wasn't just a room. That was a suite. That was champagne. That was a very, very expensive dinner. My hands started to shake. I clicked on the charge. The date, October 31st, October 31st. Halloween. I leaned back, my chair giving a small squeak in the absolute silence of the apartment. Where was Mark on October 31st? He was at a conference. Yes, that was it. A one-day Urban Futures panel, right here in the city. He'd texted me that night. Going to be late, sir. Keynote speaker is a friend. He's insisted on a late dinner. He hadn't come home. He'd texted again around midnight. Way too much wine. Friend is letting me crash in his suite at the conference hotel. Cheaper than an Uber, and I have to be back for the 7 a.m. breakfast panel. See you tomorrow, the conference hotel. I pulled up the event page from that date. The Urban Futures panel was held at the Marriott downtown, a beige, boring, functional business hotel. The Cypress Tower was a 10-minute cab ride away, and it was the opposite of functional. It was a statement. It was a destination. It was, as the magazines called it, notoriously romantic. My blood was ice water. The room was freezing, but a hot, sick sweat was building on my neck. He was with someone. He had used a work lie to cover a hotel tryst. He had broken rule number 3. He had violated our sacred agreement. But with who? A stranger? One of his Alice types? Why would he take a stranger to our hotel? A new, colder thought inserted itself into my brain. She's a firecracker. She's brilliant. Chloe and I are just... No, he wouldn't. He swore. Rule number 1. He used rule number 1 as his alibi. She's a kid. She's my protege. Don't be paranoid. My hand was trembling so hard I could barely control the mouse. I opened a new browser tab. The click, click, click of the keyboard was the only sound in the room. I typed Chloe Renault into the Instagram search bar. Her profile was public. Of course it was. She was 31. She was building her brand. Her profile picture was a professional headshot. She was beautiful in that sharp, angular, ambitious way. Dark hair, bright red lipstick. I felt a wave of nausea. I started to scroll, my life, my marriage, my sanity. It all unraveled in a series of 1080x 1080 pixel squares. Here she was at a fundraiser. Mark was in the background, a blur of a tuxedo talking to the councilman. Here she was at a team dinner. At our favorite restaurant, the one I'd introduced Mark to. I kept scrolling down. Past pictures of her models, her degree, her cat, her spicy margaritas with friends. Down, down, down. Back to the end of October. And I stopped. The date on the post, November 1st. My blood roared in my ears. I couldn't hear. I could only see. The picture was a close-up. It was artfully framed. 2 champagne flutes held high, clinking together. The background was blurry, but I could see the distinctive pinpoint lights of the city skyline. It was the view from the Cypress Tower. One hand was hers. Long, elegant fingers. Nails painted a deep, dark red. The other hand was a man's hand. A strong hand in the cuff of a dark blue, expensive-looking suit. And on the ring finger of that hand was a familiar, heavy, brushed gold signet ring. Mark's ring. My gift to him for his 40th birthday. My stomach heaved. I gripped the edge of my desk. The laminate was cold and sharp under my fingers. I read the caption. It was only 3 words. 3 words and a small winking emoji of a champagne glass. To new beginnings. I stared at the screen. The light from the window was so bright it hurt my eyes. To new beginnings. This wasn't an experiment. This wasn't a fling. This wasn't just sex. This was a celebration. This was a plan. He hadn't just broken the rules. He had used the rules. He had invented the rules. The entire open relationship, my panic, my pain, my hollow date, my agreement. It wasn't an evolution. It was a smokescreen. It was a 6-month strategy to keep me quiet, to make me complicit, to make me gaslight myself, while he built a new life with my replacement. I looked at the credit card statement, still glowing on the other side of my monitor. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had made me pay for the champagne. A new feeling was dawning, pushing through the nausea, through the ice in my veins. It was something colder and harder than grief. It was rage, a pure structural, architectural rage. He hadn't just broken my heart. He had insulted my intelligence. He came home on Sunday at 9:17 p.m. I heard the key in the lock, the specific heavy thunk as the deadbolt retracted. I was sitting at the dining room table, the table where we'd set the rules. My laptop was open. Beside it, in a neat, razor-sharp stack, were the papers. The Amex statement was on top. I hadn't cried. The shock had burned past tears and settled into something cold and dense, like a block of ice in my chest. My hands were perfectly steady. While he'd been on his conference, I had been downloading bank statements, joint investment accounts, credit card logs. I was an architect. I was reading the blueprint of my own demolition. He walked in, dropping his carry-on bag by the door. Hey, God, that was a long drive. Traffic was... He stopped. The apartment was dark, except for the cone of light from the dining room fixture illuminating my stack of papers. Sarah? He said, his voice wary. The jovial, road-weary husband persona evaporated. What are you doing? Sitting in the dark with the bills? I'm not sitting with the bills, Mark. I'm sitting with the evidence. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was flat, cold, and had an echo to it in the cavernous, silent room. He didn't move. He just watched me. You're still on that? I told you, you're being paranoid. Am I? I tapped the Amex statement with one finger. The Cypress Tower, 8/47/22 on Halloween. The night you were crashing in your friend's suite at the Marriott. His face, which had been set in a mask of tired patience, went absolutely white. He had the look of a man who had just walked full speed into a glass wall. That, he stammered, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. That was a client, a new investor. I was wooing him. Were you? I slid the credit card bill aside, revealing the 8x10 glossy printout I'd made at the office supply store down the street. The Instagram photo, the 2 champagne flutes, the city lights, the dark red nails, his ring. Because this doesn't look like an investor, Mark. This looks like Chloe Renault. I let the silence hang. It stretched, thin and suffocating. He stared at the picture, at his own hand, caught, documented, irrefutable. He looked up at me, and the man I had known for 20 years vanished. The charm, the warmth, the progressive husband. It all just switched off. His face hardened into something I'd never seen before. A cold reptilian fury, so what? He hissed. The words hit me harder than a slap. Not denial. Not an apology. So what? So, I said, my voice shaking, but not with fear, with rage. Rule number 1, Mark, your rule. No one from our professional or social circles. You swore to me. And you agreed to this, Sarah. He took a step toward me, his voice no longer a hiss but a low, vibrating growl. You opened the door. You can't just open the goddamn door and then get angry when someone walks through it. This isn't someone. This is your protege. This is an affair. It's a relationship, he roared, slamming his hand down on the table. The papers jumped. It just happened. We have a connection. Something real. Not like that. That dried up, comfortable routine you were clinging to. You lied to me, I whispered, the ice in my chest finally cracking. You're a hypocrite, he shot back, jabbing his finger at me. You went on a date. You went out and slept with some app guy. I didn't. I had one drink and it was horrible. But you went. You can't stand there and act all virgin martyr about this. You agreed to the terms, Sarah. You just didn't like the competition. I stared at him. He was doing it. He was twisting my one miserable, coerced date into his justification. My consent was his alibi. The open relationship wasn't a mistake. It was his weapon. It was a smokescreen, I said, the words tasting like ash. All of it. The 6-month experiment. The rules. It was all a lie so you could do this. He actually smiled. A thin, cruel, triumphant smile. Call it whatever you want, he said. He straightened his jacket. The debate was over. He'd already won. I'm done. I'm done with this. I'm done with this. He gestured. Not at me, but at the apartment. At our life. I'm going to a hotel, he said, turning to grab his coat. You mean her apartment, I said. My voice was dead. He didn't even look back. He just picked up his carry-on bag from the floor. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, he said. The door snicked shut. The deadbolt thunked. I sat there in the cone of light for a very, very long time. 2 days later, the knock came. Not a text, not a call. A sharp, impersonal rap that echoed through the quiet apartment. A man in a cheap, rumpled suit stood in the hallway. He looked bored. Sarah Knowles? Yes? He thrust a thick 9x12 manila envelope at me. You've been served. I closed the door. I didn't open the envelope for an hour. I walked over to the Eames chair, the one I had saved for 6 months to buy, and sat down. The leather was cool against my skin. I finally tore the flap. In re, the marriage of Mark Knowles and Sarah Knowles. Petition for dissolution of marriage. It wasn't just a divorce filing. It was an ambush. My hands, which had been so steady, were shaking violently now. I paged through the legalese, past the irreconcilable differences, until I got to the schedule of assets and debts, and I saw it. Renaud Knowles Development, LLC, a new firm, formed. My eyes scanned the filing date, 3 months ago. Right after Mark had poached his brilliant new protege, I kept reading. I saw the transfers. The large 5-figure sums moved from our joint business account, the firm I had co-founded, the accounts I managed, into this new entity. Line items labeled as consulting fees, project reimbursements. He hadn't just left me. He had robbed me. He had been systematically gutting our marital assets, funneling my money, our money, to fund his new life, his new firm, with his new, younger partner. The 6-month experiment line clicked into place. It wasn't a trial period. It was a fiscal quarter. It was his runway. It was the exact amount of time he needed to get his new company solvent before he could serve the papers. The phone on the kitchen island rang. The sound was so violent, so piercing, I almost screamed. I looked at the caller ID. Thompson Realty. Our realtor. I picked it up. My hand was numb. Sarah? Hi, a bright, chirpy voice said. Listen, Mark gave me the good news. We're so excited to list the apartment. I just need to schedule the photographer. Are you available? I dropped the phone. It clattered onto the quartz. The realtor's voice, a tiny, tinny buzz. I looked up. I saw my reflection in the dark, silent windows of the 30th floor. The woman staring back was a stranger. A pale, hollowed-out woman in a beautiful, empty glass box that was no longer hers. He had taken him. He had taken my money. And the woman who had said yes to save her marriage? He had taken her, too. I was living in a box. A white, sterile 2-bedroom rental on the 4th floor of a complex that smelled of cheap paint and industrial-strength carpet cleaner. The windows faced a brick wall and a parking garage. I was surrounded by cardboard, boxes of books, boxes of clothes, boxes of kitchenware, boxes full of the 20 years I was now supposed to fit into 900 square feet. I hadn't unpacked. I just sat on the floor, my laptop balanced on a box labeled Linens, a stack of legal binders beside me. The bitterness was a physical taste, like old coffee grounds at the back of my throat. I was sifting through an old external hard drive, a backup of our digital lives. I was looking for old tax returns, anything my forensic accountant might have missed. My mouse hovered over a file. Mark VM 2015.mp3, a numbness in my fingers made me click it. The sound that filled the empty room was a shock. It was his voice. Not the cold, sharp voice of our last fight. Not the persuasive, charming voice of the open relationship proposal. It was the voice of the man I'd married. Sar, it's me. God, I'm sitting in this meeting and they are all idiots. You're the smartest person I know. You're my rock. I'd be lost without you. Anyway, just call me back. I closed my eyes. The cheap paint smell was overwhelming. He didn't betray a fool. He didn't betray a possessive, old-fashioned wife. He betrayed his rock. He betrayed the smartest person he knew. He knew exactly who I was, what I was capable of, and he still built his entire plan on the assumption that I would be too weak, too afraid, too compliant to see it. The grief, which had been a suffocating, heavy fog, suddenly snapped into focus. It didn't disappear. It crystallized. It became cold and hard and precise. It became a blueprint. The woman who was afraid of being old-fashioned was gone. The people-pleaser who had said yes when her entire body screamed no was a liability. She was dead. The architect was in charge now. He had used the rules of marriage to break me. I would use the rules of business to break him. The next 3 weeks were not about emotion. They were about logistics. I sat in a small, glass-walled office with a woman named Elena, my forensic accountant. She had sharp eyes and didn't smile. I loved her for it. Here, I said, pointing to my laptop screen, to the joint business accounts I had managed for 2 decades. This consulting fee for $50,000 to RK Development. That was the week we were in Italy for our anniversary. We had no consultants. Elena just nodded, her fingers flying across her keyboard. Click, clack, click, clack. It was the sound of a hammer. Fraudulent dissipation of assets, she murmured. He's not even being subtle. I met a journalist in a quiet coffee shop that smelled of burnt beans and cardamom. Her name was Anya. She was known for her sharp, incisive profiles of the city's tech and development leaders. I'm not here to give you a story about a cheating husband, I said, my hands wrapped around a warm ceramic mug. I'm here to give you a story about a female co-founder. I'm here to talk about how Mark Knowles and Chloe Renault funded their new progressive firm. He used our marital assets as his illegal seed money. This city, I said, echoing his own word, this progressive city deserves to know how its new power couple really does business. Anya stopped stirring her coffee. She clicked her pen. Tell me more. The linchpin, however, I found myself. Alone, at 2 a.m., in my box, surrounded by boxes. I was on the old server backup from our home office. A folder I'd never looked in. Troll hiring proposal, February. I had said yes in May. I clicked. It wasn't just a proposal. It was a business plan, an email from Mark to Chloe. The 6-month transition plan looks solid. The firm will be solvent by Q4. We just have to keep Sarah compliant until the assets are fully transferred. Compliant, not happy, not on board. Compliant. The word echoed in the silent, sterile room. He had written the blueprint for his betrayal, and he had been stupid enough to save it. The day of the divorce hearing was cold. We weren't in a courtroom, but a sterile, wood-paneled conference room. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax and expensive, anxious cologne. Mark sat across the table. He looked fantastic. His suit was sharp, his silver hair was perfect. He gave me a small, sad, "Isn't this a shame?" smile. Chloe was not there. My lawyer, a shark in a $3,000 gray suit, began. "Mr. Knowles," she said, her voice like ice, "we have a counter-offer to your generous proposal." She slid a thick, spiral-bound binder across the polished table. "This is the full report from the forensic accountant detailing every dollar you fraudulently diverted." Mark's lawyer opened it. He paled. Mark just leaned over. "It's boilerplate, a negotiation tactic. And this," my lawyer continued, sliding her personal tablet over, "is this morning's Austin Digital Chronicle." Mark's lawyer tapped the screen. The headline was live. The unopened ledger, how Knowles Renault Development was funded by fraud. My interview. The story of the female co-founder. The quotes from investors. The paper trail. It was all there. We heard it before we saw it. Mark's phone on the table began to vibrate. A text, then another, and another. A furious, buzzing swarm. His lawyer's phone began to do the same. Mark snatched his phone up. His arrogant smirk dissolved. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly, gray pallor. He saw the story. He saw the quotes. He saw his progressive reputation, the one he'd cultivated for 20 years, being demolished in real time. "This is," he stammered, looking at me. "This is a lie, is it?" My lawyer slid one last piece of paper across the table. A printout of the email from February. "Or is this?" Mark read it. "I'll keep Sarah compliant." The color drained from his lawyer's face. He leaned over and whispered, "They have you on premeditated fraud, Mark. This is criminal." Mark just stared at me, his mouth open. The mask was gone. He was ruined. He cornered me by the elevators. The charm was back, desperate and frantic. "Sarah! Sar, wait!" He grabbed my arm. I yanked it free, my skin crawling at his touch. "We can fix this. We can put out a joint statement." I just stared at him. I felt nothing, just a vast, cold quiet. The charm failed. The rage came. You bitch!" He hissed, his face twisting. "You've ruined me. You've ruined everything." "Have I?" The rage collapsed. He deflated, becoming a small, terrified man in an expensive suit. He was begging. "Please, Sarah," he whispered. "They're pulling out." "The investors?" "Chloe just texted me. It's all gone. It's all gone. Please, what do you want?" "I'll give you anything." I looked at him. My rock. The man I would have died for. "You misunderstood the arrangement, Mark," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the lobby's hum. I adjusted the strap of my bag. "You thought you were opening a door. You were just giving me the blueprint to your new foundation." I reached into my bag and pulled out a single folded paper. Our final settlement offer, the one that gave me the full, unencumbered value of our original firm and left him with Renault Knowles Development and the entirety of its new, catastrophic debt. I pressed it into his hand. And as an architect, I said, I had to point out the structural flaws. The elevator dinged behind me. I turned, got in, and pressed lobby. The door slid shut on his face, a mask of pale, frozen horror. Months later. My office is smaller. It's on the second floor of a refurbished warehouse. It smells of exposed brick, fresh sawn wood, drafting paper, and strong black coffee. My name is on the glass door. Knowles Design. I was leaning over a table, a real blueprint spread out, its chemical smell sharp and clean. A young intern, maybe 22, was pointing at a section. "Ms. Knowles," she said, her brow furrowed. "I'm worried about the load-bearing capacity here. The facade is beautiful, but I think it's hiding a problem." I looked at her and I smiled. It was a real smile. It felt rusty, but it worked. "Good catch," I said. "Never trust a charming facade. Let's look at the foundation." I am 49. I look it. There are lines around my eyes that weren't there a year ago. I am alone, but I am not lonely. The silence in my new, smaller apartment, the one with the window that faces a row of oak trees, doesn't feel like an absence. It just feels quiet. I lost him. And I lost that woman, the one who was so afraid of being old-fashioned that she betrayed herself. But I built this. I built it from the rubble.